The village of Lanco clung precariously to the very edge of dense, ancient forest, a place where the sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy and shadows stretched long even at noon. The air, perpetually cool and moist, carried the pervasive scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a community steeped in tradition, where the whispers of generations past often held more sway than the pragmatic pronouncements of the present. Its very heart seemed to beat to the slow, rhythmic drum of old ways, its pulse a steady counterpoint against the distant clamor of modernity. Just beyond the village's last scattering of thatched roofs, hidden behind a grove of gnarled banyan trees, lay the ancient cemetery. It had been abandoned for as long as any living villager could recall, its weathered headstones leaning at precarious angles, gradually being swallowed by a tide of creeping moss and wild grass. No new burials had taken place there for decades, yet its presence loomed large in the village psyche, an unspoken truth, a quiet dread. For it was said, in hushed tones around flickering hearths and beneath the veil of starless nights, that the ancient cemetery was not truly dormant. Every time the breath left a villager's body, whenever a soul departed its mortal coil, a new coffin would, without any rational explanation, manifest within its neglected grounds overnight. A chilling tradition, born of fear and fueled by the inexplicable. Anne, a young man whose spirit had been forged in the skepticism of city life, had returned to Lanco just weeks prior. His mother, her face now etched with the weariness of a quiet, ancestral home. He was a man of reason, a seeker of logical explanations, someone who scoffed inwardly at the spectral tales that defined his grandmother's generation. Yet even Anne, with all his modern sensibilities, could not entirely shake off the faint, lingering echo of his grandfather's voice. Ông Nội, a man whose eyes held the wisdom of 1,000 forgotten stories, had often spoken of chiếc quan tài không người, the coffin with no one. It was a tale he dismissed as mere folklore then, a fanciful ghost story told to eager children on stormy nights. Now, in the very heart of the village where such legends were born, a strange tension began to hum beneath his skin. The night he would forever remember began with a furious downpour. Rain lashed against the brittle window panes of his small ancestral home, a relentless drumming that seemed to drown out all other sounds. The wind howled through the banyan trees, a mournful cry that seemed to carry the sorrows of the world. Anne sat by his mother's bedside, listening to her shallow, rattling breaths, the weight of her illness a heavy cloak around his heart. The flickering oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, making familiar objects appear monstrous and unsettling. Suddenly, a frantic commotion erupted from the village square. A terrified shriek tore through the deluge, followed by the frantic barking of dogs and the shouts of men. Anne rushed to the nearest window, peering out into the blurry expanse of the night. Lanterns flickered wildly, bobbing like agitated fireflies through the sheets of rain. The sounds grew closer, a cacophony of fear, confusion, and urgency. Moments later, the village watchman, Cụ Sơn, burst into their modest home, his clothes soaked, his face ashen with terror. His breath hitched in his throat, and his eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted around the dimly lit room as if pursued by unseen specters. Cụ Sơn was an old man, typically stoic and unshakable. A man who had faced down wild boars và even wilder superstitions without a tremor. But tonight, his composure had utterly deserted him. Anh! Cụ Sơn gasped, clutching at his chest, rainwater streaming from his ragged hair and beard. It's happened again. The cemetery. Another one. An felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Another what, cụ son? He asked, his voice calmer than he felt, a deliberate effort to project an aura of control. He already knew, with a certainty that unnerved him, what the old man was about to say. The ancient legend, the forgotten stories whispered in childhood, suddenly felt terrifyingly real. A coffin, Cụ Son choked out, his voice a ragged whisper that barely cut through the sound of the storm. In the clearing, right in the middle, brand new, polished wood, not a speck of dust, but empty, Anne, completely, utterly empty. The words hung on an oppressive air, heavy but chilling, like a death knell. His mother, stirred by the escalating commotion, let out a soft moan from her bed. An glanced at her, a pang of fierce protectiveness coiling in his gut, then back at Cụ Sơn, whose whole body trembled violently, uncontrollably. The watchman, a man who had patrolled the eerie expanse of the cemetery for over 40 years, had never seemed so utterly broken. Soon, the entire village was wide awake, drawn from their slumber by the watchman's panicked cries and the chilling news that followed. They gathered in the square, a frightened, huddled mass under makeshift shelters, their faces illuminated by the eerie, dancing glow of storm lanterns. Whispers spread like wildfire through the terrified crowd, each word fanning the already blazing flames of fear. An omen, someone hissed, someone will die soon, another whimpered, clutching a child close. The collective dread was a palpable, suffocating blanket that descended upon the small, isolated community, stilling their breath, Varizen. Anne listened to the rising tide of fear, his mind racing, attempting to anchor itself in logic. He was a man of science, a man who sought irrefutable facts, not baseless fables. Yet the watchman's raw, genuine terror, the pristine, polished newness of a coffin appearing in a neglected, ancient cemetery, the absolute, chilling lack of any logical explanation for its sudden manifestation, pricked sharply at the edges of his hardened skepticism. His rational mind wrestled fiercely with the primal fear that radiated from the villagers. How could a coffin simply appear, and an empty one at that? The implication was brutally clear to everyone else. A vacant coffin was not a vessel for a soul already departed, but a terrifying prophecy for the living. It was a sign, a chilling invitation, a placeholder for a soul yet to be claimed. It waited, pristine and ominous, an open maw ready for its rightful, fated occupant. Anne, however, refused to surrender to the pervasive, irrational fear. His grandfather's stories, once mere childhood memories devoid of real substance, now returned with a new, unsettling clarity. He remembered the specific gravitas ông Nội used when he spoke of the chiếc quan tài hông người. Was it possible there was more to this than just a morbid superstition? Was there a hidden truth beneath the surface of this chilling phenomenon? The answers, Anne decided with a sudden resolve, would not come from fearful whispers or ancient beliefs. They would come from careful observation, from logic, from a direct confrontation with the inexplicable. He would not let his village be consumed by a fear born of ignorance. He would not let the ominous shadow of a new, empty coffin dictate their fate. A strange, steely resolve hardened his gaze, pushing aside the last vestiges of doubt. He would go to the cemetery. He would see this coffin with no one for himself, and he would find an explanation. His mother, weakly calling his name, reminded him of his duty, but also of the fragility of life. Perhaps, in understanding this strange, unsettling occurrence, he could protect her, protect his beloved village. with the incessant drumming of rain as his only companion, and the chilling premonition of the villagers echoing in his ears, Anne stepped out into the stormy night, heading towards the dark, silent grove where the old cemetery lay, and where an empty coffin waited. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle by the time Anne reached the winding path leading to the ancient cemetery, but the wind still howled, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, a faint, metallic tang that Anne couldn't quite place. His lantern cast a wavering circle of light, dancing ahead of him, revealing skeletal tree branches that clawed at the sodden sky. Each rustle of leaves, each groan of an old tree, seemed amplified on the oppressive silence that now enveloped him, a stark contrast to the earlier commotion in the village. Despite his determined skepticism, a prickle of unease had but now to crawl beneath his skin. The villagers' fear, though dismissed as superstition, was a tangible force, a heavy blanket of dread that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the air. Anne tightened his grip on the lantern, his logical mind pushing back against the subtle chill that had nothing to do with the night's code. This was not about ghosts, he reminded himself, but about unexplained phenomena, and every phenomena had an explanation, however obscure. He pushed through the heavy, water-laden fronds of the banyan trees that guarded the cemetery's entrance, their gnarled roots like ancient, sleeping serpents. The air grew colder here, the silence deeper, broken only by the drip of water from the leaves and the rhythmic thud of his own heart. The gravestones, barely visible from gloom, leaned like weary old men, their inscriptions long since eroded by time and weather. This was a place of forgotten memories, of restless earth, a testament to the inexorable march of time. Then he saw it. In the very center of the overgrown clearing, bathed in the anemic glow of his lantern, sat the coffin. It was an anomaly, a stark, jarring presence against the backdrop of decay and neglect. It wasn't leaning or sunken, it rested perfectly level on the damp earth, a solitary monument of unnerving perfection. Its wood, a rich, dark hue, gleamed faintly even under the dreary sky, utterly unmarked by mud or debris. It looked as if it had been placed there mere moments ago, a pristine creation set down by an invisible hand. Un approached slowly, his boots squelching softly in the mud, each step deliberate. He circled the coffin cautiously, his lantern beam sweeping across its flawless surface. It was indeed brand new, as Ku Sun had frantically described. The corners were sharp, the joints tight, the polished surface reflecting the dim light like dark water. There were no drag marks leading to it, no disturbed earth around its base that would indicate it had been carried or rolled into place. The ground immediately surrounding it was untouched, save for the rain-flattened grass. He knelt, running his gloved fingers along the grain of the wood. It was cool and smooth beneath his touch, utterly devoid of dust or grime. He leaned closer, taking a deep breath, and a faint, sweet scent of freshly cut timber, a subtle aroma of cedar or cypress, filled his nostrils. It was the smell of a craftsman's workshop, of wood freshly planed and sanded, not of something left out in a stormy field overnight. His rational mind, already struggling, faltered further. This wasn't merely odd, it was impossible. Anne rose, his mind grappling with the sensory evidence. No footprints, no dust, the smell of new wood, no signs of transport. He pressed his palms against the lid, feeling the solid weight of it. It was heavy, built to last, a testament to skilled hands. He tried to pry it open, just a fraction, but it was firmly shut, sealed with an invisible precision. The mechanism, whatever it was internal, seamless. Then, as his lantern light grazed the very edge of the lid, near where the two halves met, he noticed something. It was incredibly faint, almost imperceptible, etched so lightly into the dark wood that it could be mistaken for a natural flaw in the grain. He had to crouch low, tilting his head, bringing the lantern almost to touch the surface. There, a tiny, almost hidden detail revealed itself. It wasn't a flaw, it was a carving, a single, stylized symbol, or perhaps a letter from an archaic alphabet he didn't recognize. It was deeply worn, as if centuries of subtle erosion had almost erased it, yet it was undeniably there. It consisted of 3 parallel vertical lines, intersected by a shorter, slightly curved horizontal line at the top, like an ancient, simplified trident or a forgotten runic character. It pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible glow in the lantern light, an illusion perhaps, but enough to make his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just a randomly appearing coffin, this was a marked coffin. Anne stared at the symbol, a wave of profound bewilderment washing over him. His scientific certainty, his staunch disbelief in the supernatural, was crumbling under the weight of this undeniable, tangible impossibility. He had come seeking a rational explanation, a trick of light, a human prank, or perhaps an elaborate, albeit morbid, marketing stunt by some eccentric local. But this defied all logic he possessed. How could a brand new, freshly carved coffin appear in the middle of a deserted, abandoned cemetery, bearing a mysterious ancient symbol with no trace of how it got there? The cold air seemed to penetrate his bones, and for the first time, Anne felt a tremor that had nothing to do with the wind. The villagers' fear, the chilling whispers of an omen, no longer seemed entirely unfounded. The coffin with no one was not merely a local legend, it was a physical, perplexing, and deeply unsettling reality. His rational mind screamed for an explanation, any explanation, but the cemetery offered only silence and the undeniable, impossible presence of the polished, unmarked wood. He stood there for a long time, the only living soul in the place of the dead, wrestling with the bizarre evidence before him. The rain began to pick up again, heavier now, blurring the edges of the ancient headstones, but Anne barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on the faint, enigmatic symbol on the coffin lid, a silent challenge to everything he believed. He had come to investigate, to disprove the superstitious fears of his people. Instead, he had stumbled upon a mystery far deeper, far more unsettling than any ghost story. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that his journey into the unknown had just begun. He would not leave this village until he understood. Anne returned home as dawn began to bleed faint gray light into the bruised sky, the rain having finally ceased its relentless assault. His clothes were damp, his boots caked with cemetery mud, but it was the disquiet in his mind that truly chilled him to the bone. The image of the pristine, silent coffin, with its faint, ancient carving, was seared into his memory. He had gone seeking rational answers, convinced he would find a logical explanation, a mundane truth hidden beneath layers of village superstition. Instead, he had found only deeper, more unsettling questions. His mother was still asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Anne changed into dry clothes, moving with a quiet purpose, his mind replaying every detail of his encounter in the cemetery. The absence of footprints, the fresh scent of wood, the utter stillness of the clearing around the coffin. It all defied conventional explanation. This wasn't some village prank. It was something far more profound, far more unsettling. He brewed a strong pot of tea, the comforting aroma of ginger and jasmine doing little to calm the agitated rhythm of his thoughts. He tried to force himself to think logically, to break down the impossible into manageable parts. Perhaps the coffin had been dropped by some incredibly precise, silent method. A helicopter? A drone? But even then, the ground around it was undisturbed. And the ancient symbol? It spoke of an artistry, a deliberate marking, not some haphazard delivery. The more he tried to apply reason, the more stubbornly the reality của chiếc quan tài không người resisted. As the village slowly stirred to life, a low murmur of conversation replaced the earlier frantic shouts. The fear, though subdued, was still palpable, a lingering fog that clung to every doorway and whispered from every gathering. Antuk can feel their eyes on him, curious, apprehensive, perhaps even a little accusatory. He was the city boy, the skeptic, the one who didn't believe. And now he had faced the impossible. He spent the morning tending to his mother, preparing her a light broth, changing her bandages. Her fragile state made the bizarre events of the night feel even more ominous. He couldn't shake the villagers' prophecy, someone will die soon. The thought twisted a knot in his stomach. He had to understand this, not just for his own peace of mind, but for the safety of his ailing mother, for the entire village. That night, as darkness once again descended upon Langko, An lay awake in his bed, the silence of the old house amplifying every creak and groan of settling wood. He tried to read, to distract his mind with the printed words on the page, but his eyes kept returning to the floorboards. The memory of the symbol, the inexplicable presence of the coffin gnawed at him. Then it began. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Thump, thump, thump. It came from directly beneath his bed, from somewhere in the foundations of the house. 3 distinct taps, spaced evenly, almost gentle, yet utterly chilling in their context. Anne's breath hitched. He sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited, straining his ears, but there was nothing more. Only the quiet drip of water from the eaves, the rustle of leaves outside, and the frantic pounding of his own pulse. He told himself it was the house settling, the old timbers contracting in the cool night air. A rat, perhaps, scurrying beneath the floorboards. But the taps had been too deliberate, too distinct, too patterned. 3 taps, and then silence. He lay back down, pulling the blanket tighter, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. But sleep would not come. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every creak of the house seemed to carry a hidden message. He listened intently, his senses on high alert, but the tapping did not return. The memory of it, however, lingered, a cold finger tracing an unsettling line down his spine. The next morning, his mother, looking a little more lucid, called him over. Her eyes were wide, a strange, haunted look in their depths. "Anne," she whispered, her voice frail, "last night, I saw someone." Anne leaned closer, his concern instantly overshadowing the lingering unease from the tapping. "Saw who, May?" "A person," she continued, her gaze unfocused, drifting towards the small, overgrown garden just beyond their window. "Dressed in mourning clothes. Standing in the yard, just watching." She shuddered, a full-body tremor that wrecked her frail frame. "I thought it was one of the village women come to check on me. But when I called out, they didn't move. They just stood there, motionless, like a statue." A wave of apprehension washed over Anne. "Did you see their face, May?" She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "No, it was too dark, and they wore a wide-brimmed hat drawn low. I felt such a chill, Anne, a coldness that went right through me." Anne tried to reassure her, explaining that it was likely a trick of the light, or perhaps a lingering dream due to her illness. "It was just your imagination, meh? The wind plays tricks, especially on a stormy night." He went to the window, peering out into the sunlit garden. There was nothing out of place, no disturbed earth, no sign of anyone having stood there, just the usual tangle of bougainvillea and hibiscus. But his words felt hollow, even to himself. He remembered the taps from beneath his floorboards. 3 distinct taps. And now, his mother's unsettling vision. Were these isolated incidents, or were they connected? Were they somehow related to the mysterious coffin that now rested in the ancient cemetery? That night, the tapping returned. Thump, thump, thump. 3 times from beneath his bed. He almost cried out, but clamped his mouth shut, his heart racing. He forced himself to be still, to listen, to analyze. It wasn't the sound of wood settling. It wasn't a rat. It was too precise, too deliberate. It was a communication, a signal of some kind. He lay there, terrified, but also strangely fascinated. What was it? Who was tapping? And why? As he finally drifted into a fitful sleep, exhausted by the day's anxieties and the strange occurrences of the night, Anne found himself plunged into a vivid, disorienting dream. He was standing in the ancient cemetery again, but this time it was transformed. The old headstones were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of unmarked, mounded earth. And in the center of it all, a single, humble, anonymous grave. As he watched, mesmerized by the eerie tableau, the earth on the grave but do sweat. Slowly, inexorably, the mound of soil but do mukdo to vibrate as if something to Benzui was pushing against it. And then, with a soft, guttural groan, the earth on the nameless grave but do lernling, slowly, steadily, as if fue looks at by a nabla. It peeled back, revealed only profound, inky blackness beneath, an echoing void that seemed to reach out, beckoning him closer. Anne woke with a gasp, his body slick with cold sweat, the image of the opening grave burning behind his eyelids. The dream was so visceral, so unsettling, that it felt more like a memory than a mere figment of his imagination. The tapping had ceased. The house was silent once more. But the silence now felt even more menacing, a quiet prelude to something he couldn't yet comprehend. The logical explanations he clung to so fiercely were rapidly eroding, replaced by a growing sense of dread and a chilling suspicion that the chiếc quan tài không người was not just an external phenomenon, but something that was beginning to infiltrate the very fabric of his life, demanding his attention, drawing him into its silent, ancient mystery. He knew with a certainty that both terrified and compelled him that he had to delve deeper. This was no longer just an investigation. It was becoming a personal journey into the heart of the inexplicable. The escalating strangeness of the tapping and his mother's haunting vision, coupled with the vivid nightmare of the opening grave, convinced Anne that he could no longer rely solely on his own deductions. His scientific training, while useful for observing phenomena, offered no framework for these increasingly personal and unsettling experiences. He needed insight, a connection to the village's deep-seated history, a perspective that transcended his modern skepticism. There was only one person in Langko who might possess such knowledge: Cụ Tơ. The old man lived at the very edge of the village, in a small, weathered house that seemed to have grown organically from the surrounding jungle, its walls a patchwork of ancient timber and creeping vines. He was Langko's living archive, a repository of stories, legends, and forgotten truths. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a piercing intelligence, and his hands, gnarled and trembling, had once carved intricate figures for the village temple. He was a quiet, reclusive soul, respected by all, sought out only when the village faced a mystery that defied ordinary understanding. An made his way through the village under the muted morning light, the air still heavy with the scent of damp earth. The villagers moved slowly, their faces grim, their conversations hushed. The appearance of the empty coffin had cast a long, dark shadow over Langko, transforming their vibrant community into a place of quiet dread. Unveiled their collective fear, a palpable weight that pressed down on him, urging him to find answers, to lift the curse that seemed to hang over their homes. He found Cụ Tử sitting on his porch, meticulously polishing a small wooden bird carving, his movements slow and deliberate. The old man's face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line telling a story of hardship and resilience. He wore a simple, faded aozai, and his wispy white hair was tied neatly at the back of his head. He looked up as unapproached, his ancient eyes, surprisingly clear, seeming to penetrate Un's very thoughts. He didn't express surprise at Un's visit, as if he had been expecting him. "Un," Cụ Tử said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, surprisingly strong for a man of his advanced years. "You've come about the coffin, haven't you?" An nodded. A sense of relief washed over him that he didn't have to explain everything from the beginning. Cụ Tử already knew. He seemed to know more than just what was openly discussed in the village. "Yes, Cụ Tử, and other things, strange things that have been happening." An hesitated, then decided to be forthright. "The tapping beneath my floor, my mother seeing someone in the yard, my dreams." Cụ Tử put down his carving, his gaze fixed on An, a profound sadness flickering in his eyes. He motioned for An to sit on the worn wooden bench beside him. "The tapping," he murmured, almost to himself, "and the shadow, it begins." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath, as if gathering ancient threads of memory. "There are things, An, that even the wisest among us forget, or choose to forget. Secrets buried deeper than any grave." "Tell me, Cụ Tử," An urged, leaning forward, his voice low with urgency. "What do you know about the empty coffin? What is this symbol?" Cụ Tử eyes drifted to the distant outline of the forest, towards where the cemetery lay hidden. "Long ago, An, before your time, before even my time, Langko had a master coffin maker. His name was Ông Bốn. He wasn't just a craftsman, he was an artist. They said his hands could coax life even from dead wood. His coffins were works of art, imbued with such care and respect, designed to provide comfort for the eternal journey." An listened intently, hanging on every word. "Ông Bốn understood the sacred duty of his craft," Cụ Tử continued, his voice growing softer, imbued with the weight of memory. "He believed a coffin wasn't just a box. It was the final home, the vessel that carried a soul to the next realm. He put his heart into every piece, ensuring it was worthy of its sacred purpose." A deep sigh escaped the old man's lips. Then, one night, many decades ago, Ông Bốn vanished, without a trace. His workshop was found empty, his tools neatly arranged, as if he had just stepped out for a moment, but he never returned. The villagers searched for weeks, months, but found nothing. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. An felt a chill despite the warming sun. A master craftsman mysteriously vanished. It sounded like the opening of a dark fairy tale. "But here is the secret, An." Cụ Tử leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the very air itself might be listening. The very night Ongbon disappeared, a coffin appeared in the ancient cemetery, just like this one, pristine, polished, and completely empty. Anne felt a jolt, a sudden electric current running through him. This was it, the connection, the missing piece. And what happened to it? He asked, his voice barely audible. The villagers, terrified, believing it was a bad omen, a grave waiting to be filled, decided to bury it. They thought if they put it in the ground, it would cease its ominous vigil. They dug a deep hole right there in the clearing and buried it like a nameless grave. A tomb for a ghost, a vessel for a soul unknown. Kutu shook his head slowly. A fool's errand, as it turns out. You cannot bury a promise, Anne, or a purpose. Anne's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of this forgotten history. The old cemetery, the mysterious appearance, the empty vessel. It was all a pattern, a recurring motif in the village's hidden lore. But then a thought struck him, a detail he had observed in the rain-soaked darkness. The symbol, Kutru, Anne said, bringing his hand up, drawing the 3 vertical lines with the curved horizontal line in the air. Did Ongbon mark his coffins? Kutu's eyes, which had been fixed on the distance, snapped back to Anne, wide with a sudden, startling recognition. A slow, knowing smile, tinged with sadness, spread across his ancient face. He reached out a trembling hand, then gently touched Anne's arm. "That symbol, Anne," he said, his voice now imbued with a profound certainty, "is Ongbon's personal mark, his signature, his seal of craft. It was his family's ancient crest, passed down through generations of master woodworkers. Only he was permitted to use it. It is the sign of the one who makes the perfect vessel. That is his mark, the mark of the coffin maker." The revelation hit Anne with the force of a physical blow. The symbol on the pristine, newly appeared coffin was the very same mark as the one used by a master craftsman who had mysteriously vanished decades ago, leaving behind an identical, empty coffin. This was no coincidence. This was a deliberate, recurring event. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were beginning to interlock, forming a chilling, coherent picture. "So, the coffin," Anne began, his voice trailing off, the implications settling in with a heavy weight. Kutu nodded, his gaze unwavering. "The coffin that appeared tonight is indeed Ongbon's creation, and the symbol you saw on it is the exact same mark he placed on every coffin he ever made. It's his way of telling us it's his handiwork. It's his silent message, Anne, from beyond the grave perhaps, or from somewhere far stranger." The old man's words hung on the air, thick with unspoken meaning, filling the space with a sense of ancient mystery and a palpable touch of the supernatural. An, the skeptic, felt his rational world spinning on its axis, his foundations beginning to crack under the weight of this impossible yet undeniably real truth. He had come for answers, and Kutu had provided them, albeit answers that pushed him further into the realm of the unbelievable. The coffin was not just an omen, it was a testament, a legacy, a living mystery calling out across time. Và những sự kiện kỳ lạ playing him, the taps, the visions, the dreams, they were all part của its silent, unfolding narrative. The revelation from Cụ Tự hung heavy in Anne's mind, a complex tapestry woven from forgotten history and chilling present-day events. Ongbon, the vanished coffin maker, and his distinctive mark, the symbol on the newly appeared coffin in the cemetery. It was a link, a direct connection that transcended mere coincidence, transforming chiếc quan tài không người from a random anomaly into a deliberate act, a recurring pattern that spanned generations. His mind, once so reliant on cold logic, now struggled to reconcile these facts with his understanding of the world. He spent the rest of the day in a haze, the old man's words replaying in his head like a spectral melody. The tapping beneath his floor, his mother's ghostly vision, his disquieting dream of the opening grave, they all seemed to coalesce around this central, profound mystery. He was no longer merely investigating. He was actively experiencing the strange unfolding Gualanco's hidden past. The weight of this realization pressed down on him, a heavy, cold hand on his shoulder. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and fiery orange, Anne found himself drawn to the dusty, neglected bookshelf in his ancestral home. It was a place he rarely ventured, filled with generations of accumulated clutter, forgotten trinkets, and crumbling texts. His grandfather, Onoi, had been a meticulous record keeper, and it was in his sprawling, often illegible handwriting that Anne hoped to find another piece of the puzzle. He began sifting through ancient scrolls, bundles of yellowed letters tied with brittle string, and weighty, leather-bound tomes that smelled of age and mildew. His fingers brushed against a thick, beautifully bound book, its cover etched with a faded, intricate pattern. This wasn't just the book. It was the family genealogy. It wasn't just a sign of death. It was a vessel, a sacred object created by a master, deliberately waiting. But waiting for whom? He began to suspect, with a chilling certainty, that the coffin was not a random occurrence, nor merely an omen. It was a deliberate creation, a vessel with a purpose, appearing only when the circumstances were just right. And the repeated appearance, the one buried decades ago and the one that had manifested only 2 nights prior, suggested a profound, unsettling truth. This particular coffin was appearing because it was waiting for someone specific. Perhaps it was waiting for the soul Kuongbon himself, eternally searching for the resting place he never had. Or perhaps it was waiting for something or someone else. The tapping beneath his flaw, his mother's vision, his dreams of the opening grave. They were not just random events. They were calls, subtle demands, escalating warnings from the coffin itself. It was beckoning, communicating, asserting its presence and its purpose. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. The empty coffin was not inert wood. It was active, sentient in some inexplicable way, a silent hunter seeking its quarry. And the cryptic message from his grandfather, combined with Kutu's story, painted a picture of a profound, unresolved spiritual imbalance. The position of the soul was empty, and the coffin, a creation of immense spiritual significance, was a tangible manifestation of that emptiness, ceaselessly seeking its rightful inhabitant. The implication was terrifying. If the coffin was indeed waiting for a specific soul, and if the mysterious occurrences around Anne were directly linked to its presence, then it was actively drawing someone towards it. And the more he investigated, the more he became entangled in its mystery. The more he wondered if he, Anne, the skeptical city boy, was becoming that very someone. The realization left him breathless, a knot of fear and strange compulsion tightening in his chest. He was no longer a detached observer. He was involved, deeply. The cryptic note from his grandfather, "Don't let the position of the soul remain empty," resonated within Anne's mind like a distant, mournful bell. Combined with Kutu's account Kuongbon's disappearance and the subsequent appearance of an identical empty coffin, it wove a chilling narrative that defied all rational explanation. Anne felt a growing certainty that the coffin was not merely a passive object, but an active entity, a deliberate beacon for a soul yet to claim its final resting place. And the strange phenomena plaguing him, the taps, his mother's vision, his dreams, felt increasingly like an insidious, undeniable call. Sleep offered no escape. It was merely a gateway to deeper unease. Each night the thump, thump, thump from beneath his floorboards returned, precisely 3 times, a rhythmic, insistent summons. An would lie awake, his heart pounding, straining to decipher the silent message, yet receiving only the oppressive weight of the unknown. His mother's condition, too, seemed to ebb and flow with the waxing and waning of these strange occurrences. Some days she seemed a little stronger, her eyes clearer, but after a night of the tapping, she would be weaker, her gaze distant, as if she, too, was sensing the subtle shifts in the village's spiritual fabric. Anne tried to dismiss his growing paranoia, to rationalize the events away. The old house was full of creaks and groans. His mother's illness made her prone to hallucinations. His dreams were merely the byproduct of stress and a vivid imagination. Yet, The sheer synchronicity, the escalating intensity gnawed at his resolve. He felt as if he was being watched, observed by an unseen presence, drawn inexorably closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He spent his days poring over the Zafa again, searching for any other overlooked details, any other clues that Ông Noi might have left behind. He visited Cụ Tứ again, hoping the old man could offer more insight, perhaps a folk remedy, a protective ritual, anything to ward off the encroaching dread. But Cụ Tứ merely shook his head, his eyes filled with a resigned sadness. Some paths, An, once begun, must be walked to their end. The coffin chooses its own way and its own time. An also found himself returning to the cemetery, drawn by a morbid curiosity he couldn't resist. He stood before the pristine coffin, the symbol on its lid now starkly visible in the daylight, a silent challenge. He touched the smooth wood, feeling its coolness against his palm, a strange mix of reverence and fear washing over him. He tried to speak to it, to demand answers, to plead for clarity, but the coffin remained utterly silent, an unyielding sentinel of unknown purpose. He felt a profound sense of isolation, standing alone in the ancient graveyard, wrestling with a mystery that felt both intensely personal and deeply ancient. One afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly, driving everyone indoors, Anne noticed a faint shimmer in the air near the coffin. It was almost imperceptible, like heat haze, but there was no direct sun on the coffin's surface, only the dappled shade of the banyan trees. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a trick of light, but the shimmer persisted, a ghostly distortion of the air itself, directly above the coffin. It was as if the very space around the coffin was vibrating with a silent energy, a hidden frequency. Later that week, while helping a neighbor repair his roof, An overheard snippets of conversation that chilled him further. Whispers of other strange occurrences in the village. A farmer claimed his prized oxen had refused to enter their stable for 3 nights, snorting and pawing at an unseen presence. A young mother reported hearing a lullaby, sung in a voice not her own, coming from her infant's empty crib. Each story, disparate yet equally unsettling, seemed to form a pattern, a quiet escalation of the inexplicable. The Chikwantai Không Người was not just affecting An, its ominous presence was slowly permeating the entire fabric of Langko, loosening the villagers' grip on their ordinary realities. An felt a growing urgency. He had to understand the coffin's purpose, its connection to Ông Bon, but above all, its insidious pull on his own life. The tapping, the visions, the dreams, they were no longer mere coincidences. They were manifestations, deliberate communications from something beyond his comprehension. He suspected that the coffin was not waiting for just any soul to die. It was waiting for a specific soul. And the more he probed, the more he felt himself being drawn into its silent, chilling embrace. One night, the rhythmic tapping beneath his floorboards intensified. It was no longer a gentle thump, thump, thump. Now it was louder, more insistent, vibrating through the wooden floor, making the small room faintly tremble. An sat up in bed, his heart hammering, a cold dread washing over him. The sounds were unmistakable, impossible to dismiss as mere house settling or rodent activity. This was deliberate. This was powerful. This was a command. He threw back his blanket, his bare feet meeting the cold floorboards. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from directly beneath his bed. It wasn't a malicious sound, not overtly threatening, but it was profoundly unsettling, a persistent, demanding presence that had invaded his private sanctuary. He knelt, pressing his ear against the wooden floor, trying to pinpoint the source. The vibrations were strongest directly under the ancient, heavy wooden bed frame. He ran his hands along the dusty floorboards, his fingers seeking a seam, a loose joint, anything that might explain the source of the persistent sound. The old house was full of secrets, he knew, but this felt different. This felt like a secret being actively revealed. His fingers brushed against something, a slight indentation, a faint ridge where two floorboards met, just a little wider than the others. He pushed, tentatively at first, then with more force. The board shifted, ever so slightly, with a faint groan of old wood. His heart leaped into his throat. He had found it, a hidden access point. With renewed resolve, Un began to pry at the loose floorboard. It was old, weathered, but surprisingly sturdy. He pulled and tugged, grunting with effort, the tapping continuing its relentless rhythm as if urging him on. Finally, with a sharp crack, the board lifted, revealing a dark, musty void beneath. He shone his lantern into the gloom, a beam of light cutting through the thick, stagnant air. What he saw there sent a shockwave through him, chilling him to the very marrow of his bones. It wasn't a crawlspace. It wasn't just a dusty gap. It was a small, crudely dug cellar, a hidden chamber beneath his very room. And in the center of that dark, forgotten space, illuminated by the trembling beam of his lantern, sat a small, ancient wooden table, its surface warped and scarred by time. And upon that table, carefully placed, lay a tattered, yellowed piece of parchment, covered in intricate sketches and lines, a blueprint của một quan tài. Một quan tài y hệt như quan tài ở chốn sống. The discovery of the hidden cellar beneath his bed and the profound revelation within it struck An with the force của một vết dập. His breath caught in his throat, and for một lúc, words seemed to spin on its axis, the familiar walls của his ancestral home dissolving into một chilling canvas của unknown. He scrambled back from the gaping hole, clutching his lantern, its beam trembling violently as his hands. The incessant thump, thump, thump from the depths below had abruptly ceased, replaced by more profound, echoing silence that felt even more menacing. He cautiously peered back into the darkness. The small, crudely dug cellar seemed to exude a cold, damp energy, its air thick with the scent of ancient earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten iron. His lantern light danced across the rough-hewn walls, revealing streaks of dried mud and root systems that snagged through the soil. This was no ordinary storage space. It was a deliberate concealment, a secret kept hidden for decades, perhaps even longer. In the center, sitting squarely on the damp floor, was the small, rickety wooden table. Its surface was scarred and pitted, warped by moisture and age, as if it had borne heavy burdens for a very long time. And upon it, illuminated by Anne's trembling light, lay the parchment. It was fragile, yellowed with time, its edges frayed, but the intricate sketches upon it were still remarkably clear. Anne carefully lowered himself into the small, confined space, the air instantly colder, heavier. He knelt beside the table, his heart hammering against his ribs, a mixture of intense fear and insatiable curiosity propelling him forward. His fingers, still trembling, reached out and gently touched the parchment. It felt like brittle, dried leaves beneath his touch, threatening to crumble at the slightest pressure. The sketches were undeniably precise, a master craftsman's detailed blueprints. Every joint, every curve, every intricate detail of a coffin was meticulously rendered. And it was unmistakable. The design was a perfect match for the chiếc quan tài khum người in the cemetery. The elegant tapering, the distinctive lid, even the subtle curve of the base, it was all there, lay out in delicate, faded ink. This was Ông Bôn's design, his magnum opus, hidden here beneath Anne's very bed. As his eyes greedily devoured the intricate drawings, searching for any further clues, his gaze fell upon a section of the parchment that was not part of the blueprint itself. Along the bottom edge, scrawled in a hasty, almost desperate hand, in an ink that appeared even darker, the more urgent than the main sketches, were a few lines of text. The script was rough, less refined than the elegant lines of his grandfather's Zafar, but the words were clear, etched with a profound, almost feverish intensity. Ai thấy được quan tài sẽ là người nó chọn. An felt a cold dread seep into his bones, seizing him with an icy grip. The words vibrated in his mind, echoing the silence of the cellar. Whoever sees the coffin will be the one it chooses. He read it again, slowly, deliberately, letting each word sink in, the full horror of its meaning unfurling before him. Whoever sees the coffin will be the one it chooses. His mind reeled. He had seen the coffin. He had touched it. He had spent days obsessing over it, investigating it, even speaking to it. Và những sự kiện kỳ lạ, the tops, the dreams, the visions his mother had experienced, all began after his initial encounter with it. The coffin wasn't just waiting, it was choosing. Và An, the skeptic, the investigator, had become its unwitting target, its chosen vessel. The realization was a terrifying, undeniable truth, a cosmic joke played on his rational mind. He wasn't merely caught in a mystery, he was at the very heart of it, destined, perhaps, for a role he never imagined. A sudden, sharp gust of wind howled through the house, rattling the windows and making the oil lamp flicker wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the cellar walls. Anne flinched, his head snapping up, his senses suddenly hyper-alert. The air above the open floorboard, previously still and stagnant, now felt cold, cutting, imbued with a palpable presence. Then a low, guttural groan emanated from the darkness above, a sound that seemed to come from the very timbers of the old house itself. It was followed by a creak, long and drawn out, as if a heavy, invisible hand was pushing against the ancient wood. Anne's eyes widened in terror as he watched, helpless, mesmerized. The front door of his house, which he had securely latched before going to bed, slowly, inexorably began to swing inward. A gust of icy wind immediately swirled through the small dwelling, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something cloying and ancient like grave dust. It was an unnatural wind, cold and purposeful, invading his sanctuary, chilling him to the bone. And then, from the direction of the now open door, from somewhere in the moonlit yard just beyond his threshold, he heard it. The familiar, chilling rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. 3 distinct taps, clearer and louder than ever before, echoing through the invaded silence of his home. They weren't coming from beneath him anymore. They were coming from outside, from the yard. The same yard where his mother had seen the figure in mourning clothes. The very yard that separated his home from the ancient forest and the cemetery beyond. Anne scrambled out of the cellar, his legs shaking, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He barely registered the parchment, the blueprints, the cryptic message. All he could focus on was the open door, the chilling sound, and the icy tendrils of fear that now coiled around his throat. The tapping, once a subtle whisper, was now a resonant, undeniable summons. The coffin, it seemed, was no longer content to wait in the cemetery. It was calling to him, directly, powerfully, demanding its chosen. He stood in the middle of his room, panting, his gaze fixed on the open doorway. The moonlight, pale and ethereal, streamed into the house, illuminating a path of profound silence. The taps had ceased, but the feeling of an immense, unseen presence lingered, a heavy weight in the air. His mind screamed for him to run, to hide, to deny this impossible reality. But a deeper, primal instinct, a chilling compulsion, urged him forward, towards the source of the taps, towards the open door. The chiếc quan tài không người was no longer a distant enigma. It had come for him. The sudden, chilling triple tap from his own yard, accompanied by the spectral opening of his front door, paralyzed An. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to flee, to barricade himself within the fragile safety of his home, to deny the impossible truth that now stared him in the face. But the fear, though profound, was intertwined with an equally potent sense of morbid fascination, a dark compulsion that rooted him to the spot. The message from the hidden parchment, "Whoever sees the coffin will be the one it chooses," echoed like a death knell in his mind, confirming his deepest, most terrifying suspicions. He stood breathless, frozen in the cold draft that now permeated his house. The open door, a gaping maw against the moonlit night, seemed to beckon him, to draw him into the unknown. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and clying, pressed down on him. The tapping had ceased, but the silence that followed was far more menacing, a prelude to something inevitable. His mother, stirred by the strange sounds and the sudden chill, let out a faint, questioning moan from her room. The sound, frail and vulnerable, snapped Anne out of his trance. He couldn't hide, he couldn't cower, not while she lay ill, defenseless, perhaps sensing the very danger that now encroached upon their home. A fierce, protective instinct flared within him, eclipsing his personal terror. He had to confront this, not just for himself, but for her. With a surge of adrenaline, Anne lunged forward, grabbing the sturdy wooden staff he kept by the door, a relic from his grandfather's days, meant for warding off stray animals. Its weight felt surprising comforting in his trembling hands. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady his racing heart, then stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the moon-drenched yard. The world outside was bathed in an eerie, silver light, casting stark, elongated shadows from the trees. The wind, which had violently thrown open his door, had now died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Every leaf, every blade of grass seemed to hold its breath. He saw nothing immediately amiss, just the familiar tangle of the overgrown garden, the shadowy forms of the banyan trees, and the faint, winding path that led towards the village and, in the opposite direction, the cemetery. "Hello?" Anne called out, his voice cracking, betraying the tremor in his throat. It sounded absurdly small, utterly inadequate against the vast, silent expanse of the night. "Hello?" Anne called out, his voice cracking, betraying the tremor in his throat. It sounded absurdly small, utterly inadequate against the vast, silent expanse of the night. There was no reply, only the distant, mournful hoot of an owl, and the soft rustle of leaves as an unseen creature darted through the undergrowth. He took another step, then another, descending the worn wooden steps of his porch, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth of his yard. He moved slowly, cautiously, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every nerve ending screaming at him to prepare for something unseen, something monstrous. The air grew colder with each step, the ancient, cloying scent becoming stronger, more defined. He reached the center of the yard, the very spot where his mother had reported seeing the figure in mourning clothes. He stopped, holding his breath, listening. The silence was absolute, a profound void that seemed to swallow all sound. He raised his lantern, its beam cutting through the gloom, searching, probing, desperate for any logical explanation. There was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, save for a few fallen leaves from the previous storm. No footprints, no trace of any presence, human or otherwise. The garden was still, the flowers drooping slightly from the rain, but otherwise unchanged. Anne's rational mind, desperate for a foothold, tried to assert itself. It must have been the wind, a trick of the light, the stress playing on his mind. The tapping, perhaps just loose debris caught in the wind, knocking against the house. But the cold certainty in his gut, the profound feeling of being watched, would not dissipate. He had heard the taps, he had seen the door open, he had read the cryptic message. These were not mere coincidences, not illusions. They were deliberate, powerful manifestations of an unseen force, directly linked to the coffin, and now directly linked to him. He stood there for a long moment, the staff clutched tightly in his hand, his gaze sweeping the entire yard, then the path leading to the cemetery. A profound sense of disorientation washed over him. He was sure, absolutely certain, that the strange force had been here, in this very spot. He could still feel the residual cold, the heavy energy clinging to the air like a shroud. Then his eyes caught something, a faint disruption in the moonlit landscape beyond his yard. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom, but it was too distant, too shadowy. He had to go closer. He had to know. The compulsion was overwhelming, an undeniable pull that transcended fear. He began to walk towards the path that led to the ancient cemetery, his steps slow and deliberate, each footfall sending a tremor of anticipation through him. He followed the winding track, the banyan trees looming like silent sentinels, their ancient branches twisting into grotesque shapes in the moonlight. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, as he approached the familiar grove that shielded the cemetery from view. As he pushed through the heavy fronds of the banyan trees, expecting to see the silent, pristine coffin exactly where he had left it, his breath hitched in his throat. He stopped dead in his tracks, his lantern beam freezing mid-air, casting a wide, trembling circle of light over the scene before him. The ancient clearing, where for days the Chikwantai Hongngui had stood as an enigmatic sentinel, was now utterly, completely empty. The coffin was gone. Anne's mind reeled, struggling to comprehend this new, impossible twist. It wasn't just gone, there was no trace of it ever having been there. The ground was undisturbed, the flattened grass where it had rested now slowly regaining its natural shape. There were no drag marks, no impressions, no evidence whatsoever of a heavy object having been removed. It had simply vanished, as mysteriously as it had appeared. He stumbled forward, running into the clearing, desperate to find some sign, some explanation. He circled the empty space frantically, his lantern beam sweeping across the ground, illuminating every blade of grass, every pebble. Nothing. The cemetery was just as it had been churned before the coffin's appearance, neglected, overgrown, a place of forgotten memories and undisturbed earth. The profound emptiness of the clearing was almost more terrifying than the coffin itself. It meant movement. It meant agency. It meant the coffin was not a stationary object waiting to be discovered, but an active, intelligent entity capable of translocation, of appearing and disappearing at will. The knowledge sent a fresh wave of terror through him, chilling him to his very core. He stood there, panting, utterly bewildered, the silence of the cemetery pressing down on him, amplifying the frantic rhythm of his own heart. The coffin was gone. The triple tap had come from his yard. The cryptic message from the cellar had warned him.
A terrifying, undeniable realization bắt đầu cày lên trong đau đớn còi lõm của tâm hồn. Cô và Precise như một vầng đông xương tàn. He spun around, bolting from the cemetery, tearing through the banyan grove, his mind consumed by a singular, horrifying thought. He ran back along the winding path, his feet pounding in the damp earth, the staff forgotten, clattering uselessly behind him. He burst through the gate of his own yard, his eyes fixed on his house, on the now open front door, dreading yet knowing what he would find. And there it was. And Shanice burst through the gate of his own yard, his lungs burning, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The spectral emptiness of the cemetery, followed by the chilling certainty that the coffin had moved, propelled him forward with a desperate, primal urgency. His gaze was fixed on his house, on the now open front door, dreading yet knowing what he would find. And there it was.
The moonlight, pale, varying, ethereal, cast long, distorted shadows, turning his familial home into a grotesque, ominous silhouette. And there it was. Right in the center of his small, overgrown yard, bathed in the eerie silver glow of the moon, sat the coffin. It was identical to the one in the cemetery, pristine, polished, utterly untouched by the muddy earth beneath it. It rested perfectly level, a stark, jarring anomaly against the familiar backdrop of his home. It looked as if it had simply materialized there, an impossible presence defying all laws of physics and common sense. His breath hitched in his throat, a cold, hard knot of terror and disbelieving awe. The chiếc quan tài không người had come home. It had chosen him. Anne stumbled to a halt a few paces away, his mind reeling, struggling to process the surreal tableau.
The fresh scent of new wood, the very same aroma he had detected in the cemetery, now permeated his yard, mingling with the familiar scent of damp earth and the subtle fragrance of his mother's hibiscus. The air around the coffin seemed to hum with a silent, potent energy, a palpable presence that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He walked forward, slowly, cautiously, drawn by an irresistible force. His eyes scanned the ground around the coffin. Just as in the cemetery, there were no drag marks, no disturbed earth, no footprints. It was as if it had simply blinked into existence, a silent, imposing guardian now standing sentinel before his very threshold. The perfection of its appearance, the utter lack of any evidence of its movement, made it all the more terrifying. He reached the coffin, his hand hovering over its smooth, dark surface.
He could see the faint, ancient carving on the lid, the three vertical lines with the curved horizontal line. Ông Bond's personal mark, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. It was a symbol of creation, of finality. And now, it felt like a brand, a claim. The realization, cold and precise, settled in his heart. This coffin was not just a symbol of the master craftsman's legacy. It was his direct, personal summons. The lid of the coffin, unlike its previous manifestations, was not sealed. It was slightly ajar, a dark, inviting slit that hinted at the profound emptiness within. An felt a chilling premonition, a desperate urge to close it, to push back against the dark void it represented. But another, deeper compulsion urged him to peer inside, to confront the emptiness, to understand its beckoning call. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth wood. With a profound sense of inevitability, he gently pushed the lid further open. It moved with a soft, almost soundless whisper, revealing the dark, cavernous interior. As before, it was utterly, completely empty. No silk lining, no cushioning, just the smooth, polished wood qua master's craft, meticulously constructed, waiting. But as the lid fully opened, revealing the pristine interior, Anne's eyes were drawn to something he hadn't seen before. On the inside of the lid, where the wood was purest and most unblemished, a new inscription had appeared. It was freshly carved, the lines sharp and clear, etched with a precision that bespoke an otherworldly hand. The words glowed faintly, a subtle, ethereal luminescence in the pale moonlight, making them stand out against the dark grain of the wood. Chỗ còn trống là dành cho ngươi. Anne read the words aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper, each syllable a heavy stone dropped into the well of his terror. The empty space is for you. The air around him seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, stealing his breath. The full, horrifying meaning of the message crashed down on him with a crushing weight. The coffin had not merely chosen him, it had come for him. The strange events, the tapping, his mother's vision, his dreams, the hidden cellar, the cryptic message from his grandfather, and the blueprint of the coffin, it had all been leading to this moment. The coffin was not a random occurrence. It was a carefully constructed vessel with a singular purpose, appearing at intervals, seeking its destined occupant. And now it stood before him, pristine and open, its new message burning into his very soul. The empty space was for him. Anne, the skeptic, the man of reason, was now face to face with an undeniable, terrifying truth that shattered the very foundations of his rational world. He was the chosen. His mind raced, a frantic scramble for answers, for escape, for any logical way out of this impossible nightmare. Was this a curse, a spiritual debt? A final, desperate act from Ombun, eternally seeking a successor, an heir to his legacy qua the perfect vessel, or perhaps a resting place for his own wandering soul, now bound to An? He looked around his yard, the familiar sights now twisted into something menacing, something alien. His home, his sanctuary, had been invaded, transformed into a stage for this chilling, supernatural drama. His mother lay ill inside, oblivious to the profound, terrifying choice that now lay before him. The coffin remained open, silently waiting, its polished interior a dark, inviting void. The faint glow of the inscription pulsed, a rhythmic heartbeat in the moonlit night. Anne felt a profound sense of isolation, standing alone in